This is a rare Ethiopian Orthodox Bible manuscript, handwritten in Ethiopia's sacred liturgical language, Ge'ez. It's 52 leaves, 102 pages carefully preserved and written by the scribes who devoted their very lives.
What if the Jesus you were taught about was deliberately replaced? Deep in the mountains of Ethiopia, locked inside monasteries so remote that monks climb ropes on cliff faces just to reach them, the original version of Christ has survived for 17 centuries, and he is nothing like the figure in those paintings. This Jesus is so overwhelming that angels cannot look directly at him, so powerful that mountains split and the earth shakes at the sound of his voice. Mel Gibson spent 7 years buried in these ancient Ethiopian scriptures. What he found left him shaking, and what you're about to hear will permanently change the way you see the most famous figure who ever lived.
You're making this film, and the idea was that we're all responsible for this, that his sacrifice was for all mankind, and that for all our ills and all the things in our fallen nature, it was a redemption.
The world that was broken before he came. Open a Western Bible to Genesis chapter 6 and you will find 4 verses explaining why God decided to drown every living thing on earth. 4 verses. That is all you get. Beings called the sons of God came down, took human women, produced children described as mighty men of old. And then the very next line says, God saw the wickedness of man and decided to destroy everything. That is all. The Ethiopian Bible is entirely different. It dedicates 11 full chapters to this, 11 chapters of names, details, and events so specific and so disturbing that once you read them, the story of Jesus never looks the same again. What those chapters describe is a world that was taken apart piece by piece, deliberately, by frightening beings that knew exactly what they were doing. 200 angels gathered at the summit of Mount Hermon and made an oath to each other. They swore the oath specifically because what they were about to do was a direct violation of the created order, and they needed every single one of them locked in so that none could walk away once it began. Their commander was named Semyaza. His second was named Azazel. They came down to earth and took human women by force as their wives. What was born from those unions was a catastrophe that had no name yet, because nothing like it had ever existed. The Nephilim, these hybrid creatures born from angel and human flesh, grew to sizes that made ordinary people look like children standing next to them. And they had a very terrifying appetite. They tore through every food source around them, stripped communities bare, ate through livestock, ate through grain stores, ate through everything a settlement had built over generations in a matter of days. When the food ran out, they started on the people. They pulled human beings apart and drank the blood. And then, when there was nothing left around them, they turned on each other and ate themselves alive. But the physical destruction was only half of what the Watchers did. The other half was knowledge. Azazel personally taught men how to forge swords, shape shields, and build armor. He handed the technology of organized mass killing to a civilization that had never held a metal blade before, and had no concept of what that knowledge would do to the structure of human society once it was loose. He also taught women how to use cosmetics as weapons of deliberate seduction. The Book of Enoch says directly that the combination of those two things, military weapons and seduction, tore through the moral structure of human civilization like a fire through dry wood. Other Watchers poured more corruption in behind it, teaching spellcasting, reading the stars and clouds for forbidden knowledge. A Watcher named Penemu taught humanity writing with ink and paper, and the text says he handed people the bitter and the sweet secrets of wisdom. Now here is the part of the story the Western Church never told anyone. Before the flood came, God gave the archangels an order that does not appear anywhere in the Western Bible. He commanded them to force the Nephilim to destroy each other first. Thousands of these giants were turned on one another. They tore each other apart with their bare hands, while the Watchers, already dragged underground and chained in the dark by that point, could hear every moment of it happening above them. Their children were being slaughtered above the ground, while they lay bound beneath it, unable to stop a single second of it. Then the flood came and finished the rest. The Watchers were sealed in that underground darkness, chained, waiting. But here is the detail that changes everything about the New Testament, and the detail the Western Church worked hardest to bury. When the Nephilim died, their bodies were gone. Their spirits were not. The book of Enoch says it plainly in chapter 15. Because the Nephilim were hybrids, part divine and part human, their spirits did not belong to either world. They could not ascend to heaven. They could not descend into the realm of the dead with human souls. They had no place in the order of creation. So they stayed on the surface of the earth. And they did what disembodied spirits with no home and no restraint do. They forced their way inside human bodies and took up residence there. They drove sickness into those bodies from the inside. They pushed violence and corruption into minds that would otherwise have been still. The person walking around looked normal. What was living inside them was not human and had never been. Before the rain fell, God told Noah something else the Western Bible never records. The flood would clean the surface of the earth, but the watcher spirits would remain. Every generation after Noah would be born into a world those things were still moving through. And then the Book of Jubilees, another text kept only in the Ethiopian canon, adds a cold detail. Noah prayed and begged God to remove those spirits entirely. God agreed to lock 90% of them away before the final judgment. But 10% were deliberately left free, intentionally, left to roam, left to corrupt, left to work through every generation until the end of time. Noah thought he had won that prayer completely. He had not. 10% of a force that once numbered in the thousands was still more than enough to keep the world broken for thousands of years. This is the world Jesus walked into, a world where the spirits of the dead Nephilim were still inside people, still occupying bodies, still operating from within. And when Jesus cast out demons in the Gospels, when those spirits screamed and tore people apart on their way out of the bodies they had been living inside, what the Ethiopian Bible says he was doing was pulling them out one by one, dismantling the Watcher's work personally, one human being at a time. Mel Gibson understood exactly this. When he told Joe Rogan that his film had to start with the fall of the angels, he was not being theatrical. He said it directly. In order to really tell the story properly, you have to really start with the fall of the angels, which means you're in another place, you're in another realm, you need to go to hell. You cannot understand what Jesus came to fix until you understand what the Watchers broke. But if the Watchers created the problem, who exactly was the answer? Jesus. The Western Church called him a teacher, a healer, a sacrifice. The Ethiopian Bible describes something far older and terrifying. He had a title, the Son of Man. And the Church spent 15 centuries making sure you never knew what that title actually meant. The figure they erased. Jesus called himself the Son of Man more than 80 times across the 4 Gospels, more than any other name he ever used for himself, more than Messiah, more than Son of God. Western Christianity has spent 2,000 years treating those 3 words as a way of saying he was human, approachable, one of us. The Ethiopian Bible blows that interpretation apart completely. In the tradition that kept the full text, those 3 words were a declaration so historically weighted that anyone in 1st century Judea who had read the Book of Enoch would have felt the air leave the room the moment Jesus said them. But the story of who Jesus claimed to be does not begin with the Book of Enoch. It begins at the very start of human history, in a text that survives completely only in the Ethiopian Bible, called the first book of Adam and Eve. The moment Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden, the text picks up. They walk out and hit the ground and cannot get up. The text describes them as having been filled inside the garden with something called a bright nature. The moment they crossed out of the garden, that light was stripped from them. They could not see the way they had seen. They could not feel what they had felt. They were standing in a world they did not recognize, in a darkness they had no name for. In that darkness, God spoke to Adam directly, and what God said in that moment has never appeared in any Western Bible. He told Adam that he had measured out the years of human history, and that when 5,500 of those years had passed, he would send the Word down into the earth as a man born from Adam's own bloodline. That Word, the same force that had originally spoken Adam into existence, the same voice that had called light out of darkness and breathed life into the first human body, would enter the world in human flesh. That Word was Jesus Christ. The rescue was already planned. What happened next is deeply unsettling. Satan, who had heard the promise God just made to Adam, transformed himself and his entire company into blazing light, and positioned them at the entrance to the cave where Adam and Eve were sheltering. The light pouring from the mouth of the cave looked exactly like the presence of God. The sound coming from it was indistinguishable from angels in worship. Adam sat in the dark looking at it and nearly walked toward it. He stopped himself and prayed, and God sent a real angel to drive the imitation back. Before the angel left, he told Adam something that mattered. Satan's actual form was so grotesque, so completely hideous, that he could not come within range of Adam while wearing it. The disguise was the only way he could operate near anything still connected to God. That detail matters enormously because Jesus himself would later come into this world using a disguise of his own. Satan had hidden his true terrifying nature inside the appearance of something holy and beautiful to get close to humanity. Jesus would do the reverse. He would hide his true cosmic, all-powerful nature inside the appearance of an ordinary human being to get close to the enemy. Same method, completely opposite direction. Now back to those 3 words Jesus used more than 80 times. Son of Man, and what the book of Enoch reveals about what they actually meant. Enoch is taken into heaven and sees 2 figures standing together. One is the eternal God. The other is a being whose face radiates a grace so intense it is like looking at the highest order of angel. An angel explains to Enoch who the second figure is. He was not created when the world was created. He existed before the sun, before the moon, before a single star was placed in the sky. He was hidden inside the presence of God, kept completely concealed until the exact moment appointed for his emergence. In this text, Son of Man is the specific title given to this hidden, pre-existing figure. It means the one who would enter the world in human form, carrying an authority so absolute that every king, every ruler, every fallen power in creation would be dragged before him and held to account. When Jesus called himself the Son of Man in front of crowds who had read the book of Enoch, he was telling them he was the one whose name existed before the universe did. He was telling them he was the judge. This figure carries 4 titles in the Ethiopian text: the Son of Man, the Chosen One, the Righteous One, the Anointed One. Every single one of those titles was applied directly to Jesus by the earliest Christians who had grown up reading the book of Enoch and understood exactly the weight those words carried. Chapter 62 shows what this figure actually does on the day of final judgment, and it is not gentle. Every king, every emperor, every ruler who ever held power on this earth is brought before him, and they fall apart completely. The color drains out of their faces. Their bodies crumple like the bones inside them have dissolved. Shame floods through them and their eyes go completely dead, wide open but empty. They beg for mercy. They receive nothing. They are thrown into fire, and his reach does not stop at human rulers. The Son of Man comes specifically to preside over the final judgment of the Watchers themselves, the same 200 angels who descended on Mount Hermon, corrupted the earth, and produced the Nephilim before the flood, physically dragged those chained fallen angels out of their underground prison and hurl them into fire while the Son of Man presides over every sentence. He is the answer the Watchers never saw coming, and there is a specific reason they never saw him coming. His name and identity had been deliberately concealed from them before they ever fell. They had no idea such a figure existed. They corrupted the world, took their punishment, and sat chained in the dark for thousands of years with no idea that the one appointed to finally sentence them had been hidden in God's presence the entire time, waiting. Then the book of Enoch reaches its final chapter and does something that sent the early church councils into a quiet panic. God takes Enoch into the highest heaven and speaks to him directly. He says, "You are that Son of Man." The same figure Enoch had been watching in visions throughout the entire book is revealed to be Enoch himself. This sent the early church councils into a quiet panic. And here is exactly why. If the Son of Man could be Enoch, then what did that mean for Jesus, who also called himself the Son of Man? Were they the same person? Was Enoch a preview of Jesus? Was Jesus the fulfillment of what Enoch represented? The Ethiopian church taught that Enoch was exactly that, a preview, a foreshadowing, a prophecy in human form of the figure who would one day be fully revealed as Jesus Christ. But for the councils trying to draw clean, simple lines around who Jesus was and what made him unique, that kind of ambiguity was dangerous. It raised questions they did not want ordinary believers asking. So the Roman Church removed it. The book of Enoch also says that after the judgment is complete, the Son of Man will sit down and eat with the righteous. He will share a meal with the people he came to save. Centuries before Jesus sat with his disciples in an upper room in Jerusalem, the Book of Enoch had already written that scene. The Ethiopian Bible has a figure who was always going to sit at that table, whose name was spoken before the first star was lit, moving toward that moment since before the world began. The Western Bible has a Last Supper, with no backstory. The Ethiopian Bible has a promise fulfilled. Knowing who the Son of Man is still leaves one enormous question unanswered. How does a being of that magnitude enter the physical world without destroying it on contact? The answer is in a second text the Ethiopian church preserved and the Western church removed. And what it describes is nothing like the nativity scene we all know. The most dangerous secret ever written down. There is a text called the Ascension of Isaiah. It describes in extraordinary detail what the prophet Isaiah witnessed when he was taken through 7 distinct levels of heaven and shown things no recorded prophet before or after him ever saw. The complete version of this text survives in only one place on earth, the Ethiopian Bible, written in the ancient Ge'ez language. And what chapter 10 of that account describes is one of the most staggering things ever written about Jesus Christ. Isaiah is standing in the 7th and highest level of heaven, directly in front of God the Father, when he hears God issue a command to Christ. The command comes in 2 parts. The first is to descend through all 7 levels of heaven, through the boundary between heaven and earth, all the way down to the physical world to be born as a human being. The second part is the part no Western church has ever taught. God tells Christ to take on the form of whatever beings inhabit each level he passes through, look like them, sound like them, be completely indistinguishable from them, move through 7 layers of reality and leave every single being in every single layer with no idea that the Creator of all things, the Lord of all 7 heavens, just walked past them. By the time he crossed into the physical world to be born, even the lowest orders of heaven had watched him pass and noticed nothing. The enemy did not see him coming, not even close. The birth itself matched the descent perfectly. Mary was pregnant, and then between one moment and the next, the child was simply there. No labor, no physical process either Mary or Joseph could follow or account for. Joseph looked at the infant and stopped moving entirely. The text says the child's face was producing light from within and pushing it outward through skin. Joseph stood in front of a newborn and felt something crack open in his chest that he had no name for. It was terror and reverence hitting at exactly the same time. Mary felt the same thing. Neither of them needed to be told. Something ancient and enormous was inside that small body. The angel of the Spirit appeared immediately and commanded them both to say nothing to anyone. The concealment operation that had begun in the 7th heaven was still running. The lower angels had not recognized him on the way down. The people of earth were not supposed to recognize him either. Not yet. Not until the operation had fully run its course. But the most disturbing implication of this text is what it means for the crucifixion. The Ascension of Isaiah says that the ruler of this world, the prince of the fallen powers, reached out and had Christ crucified. And here is the reason the disguise mattered so completely. If Satan and the fallen powers had known who Christ actually was, they would never have touched him. They would never have demanded his execution, because what was waiting for them on the other side of that crucifixion was something they were completely unprepared for. So Christ had to look like an ordinary man, a traveling teacher from Galilee, someone the fallen powers felt confident enough to destroy. The Ascension of Isaiah also explains why Isaiah himself was murdered. In the text, the chief of all fallen powers, the same supernatural force that had been working against God's plan since the beginning, needed Isaiah silenced. Isaiah had exposed the whole strategy, including the part where the enemy gets completely destroyed by his own actions. That information could not be allowed to circulate freely, so that fallen power worked through a human being, King Manasseh, the king of Judah at the time, influencing and driving him to act. Manasseh had Isaiah arrested and executed by having him sawn in half with a wooden saw, slowly, because a dead man cannot warn anyone. Isaiah was murdered specifically to bury the secret of what was coming. And for 17 centuries, the text containing what he saw survived in Ethiopia alone, in rooms so remote that monks had to climb ropes attached to cliff faces just to reach them. The disguise held through the birth, through every healing, through every teaching, through the arrest and the trial. It held all the way to the cross. But the crucifixion was not the end of the operation. It was the moment the operation changed direction completely, because after the cross, Jesus did not simply lie in a sealed tomb waiting for Sunday morning. According to the text the Western Church spent 15 centuries burying, he went somewhere. And what he did when he got there was the single most violent and decisive event in the history of creation. What really happened in those 3 days? The Western Church gives you 3 days between the crucifixion and the resurrection, and then slides past them. The Easter sermon lands on the empty tomb Sunday morning. The silence before that, Friday night, all of Saturday, the dark hours before dawn on Sunday, is treated as a gap, a held breath between the death and the miracle. The Ethiopian texts treat those 3 days as the moment everything the mission had been building toward since before the flood finally went off. The Western Bible brushes this period in 2 places and then moves on. The letter of 1 Peter says that after his death, Christ went and proclaimed something to spirits being held in a prison. The letter to the Ephesians says he descended into the lower regions of the earth. That is everything the Western tradition gives you. The Ethiopian texts answer them in detail that makes the Easter Sunday sermon feel like a footnote. When Christ entered Sheol, which is the realm of the dead beneath the earth, he stopped concealing himself for the first time since the 7th heaven. In Sheol, that disguise ended. The full weight of what Christ actually was flooded through the realm of the dead. The angel of death, the being that had processed every human soul that ever died since Adam breathed his first breath, came face to face with that light and was completely destroyed, stripped of every ounce of power it had accumulated since the beginning of human history, in a single instant. The Gospel of Nicodemus, connected to the same tradition, describes what happened at the gates themselves, and it reads like the opening of a war. Satan and Hades, which this text treats as a distinct ruling power of the underworld, are in the middle of a conversation when a sound like rolling thunder detonates against the walls from outside. A voice drives through the gates quoting from the Psalms. "Lift up your gates, O rulers, be lifted up, O everlasting doors. The King of glory shall come in." Hades thee calls back from inside the darkness. Who is this King of glory? The answer comes back through the walls. The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord, mighty in battle. Hades immediately orders Satan out. If you are so powerful, he says, go outside and stop him yourself. Satan leaves. Hades turns to every demon in the structure and screams at them to seal the brass gates, lock the iron bars, bolt everything shut, and hold the line. Every soul that had been held in Sheol since the time of Adam starts screaming at Hades to open the doors, and then the gates explode. Not opened, not unlocked, they shattered. The brass gates came apart and the iron bars snapped, and every soul that had been chained in that place since the beginning of human history poured out of their cells like water through a broken dam. And the King of Glory walked in as a man, and every dark place in Hades lit up like it had never known a shadow. Hades screamed out loud, "We have been conquered! Woe to us!" Then Hades turned on Satan with a fury the text describes across multiple pages. "You brought me an innocent man," he said. "You crucified him, dragged him here, and brought the source of life directly into the kingdom of death. You have lost me, every soul I was holding. You will now stay here in their place." Satan had spent the entire operation believing he was winning. He had engineered the arrest, worked through the trial, driven the execution with complete confidence. And in that moment, standing in the wreckage of the gates he had ordered sealed, he understood that every move he had made to destroy Jesus had been the mechanism of his own complete destruction. He had built the trap. He had stepped into it himself. He had even pulled it shut. Now go back to what 1 Peter says. Christ preached to the spirits in prison. Scholars studying this passage alongside the Book of Enoch consistently identify those imprisoned spirits as the Watchers, the same 200 fallen angels chained underground since before the flood. The prison the Book of Enoch describes is a place with no sky above it and no earth below it, completely lightless, where 7 stars burn like mountains in an airless void, and the beings who tore apart the world before Noah sit bound in the dark waiting for the end. Christ descended to that prison. He entered it. He stood in front of the architects of the original corruption and proclaimed judgment directly to their faces. The beings who had started all of this, who had organized on Mount Hermon, who had handed humanity weapons and seduction and forbidden knowledge, who had produced the Nephilim, whose spirits were still moving through people when Jesus walked through Galilee, heard the sentence from the one whose name had been hidden from them before they ever fell. When he ascended back through the seven heavens after the resurrection, the disguise was finished. Every level of heaven he had passed through on the way down, watching him move through and registering nothing unusual, now watched him move back up in full. No concealed nature. Every order of angels in every realm was forced to bow as he passed through. On the way down, silence and confusion. On the way back up, compelled worship from every layer of reality. Before he left, he raised Adam, the first human being, held in the realm of the dead since the very beginning of human history, was taken by the hand and pulled out. Adam stood upright in the light for the first time since the garden, and he said, "I thank your majesty, O Lord, that you have brought me up out of the lowest Hades." The man to whom God had made the 5,500-year promise, who stood in the presence of the one that promise had described. The Western Church had very deliberate reasons for keeping those 3 days blank. Filling them in required explaining who had been imprisoned, why they were imprisoned, how they got there, and what Christ's presence in that prison meant for the entire structure of sin and spiritual authority. Filling them in meant reading the book of Enoch, and the men who had that book removed from the canon understood exactly what they were doing when they removed it. The men who buried him. In 312, a Roman emperor named Constantine converted to Christianity and changed the entire shape of the faith in a single morning. Before that conversion, Christianity was a scattered network of communities spread across the empire, each carrying its own texts, its own practices, and its own deeply held understanding of who Jesus was. Some communities read the Book of Enoch as scripture. Some used the Ascension of Isaiah. Nobody had standardized anything because nobody had the power to force standardization on anyone. The moment Constantine converted, that reality ended. An empire needs a unified religion. Councils were called, bishops gathered, and the question of which books belonged in the Bible stopped, became a political operation. The men in those rooms understood that certain texts were incompatible with the kind of institutional structure they needed to build. They made their decisions accordingly. The Book of Enoch had 3 specific problems that made it a removal target. The first problem was authorship. The text presents itself as written by Enoch, the man Genesis describes as someone who walked so closely with God that he never died. The councils argued that the true authorship could not be verified, and that a book written under an assumed name could not be trusted as scripture. That argument sounds principled. It was not applied consistently. Pseudonymous authorship was common across ancient literature, and the councils overlooked it regularly for texts they wanted to keep. It was applied specifically and selectively to texts they wanted gone. The second problem was the Son of Man theology. The 4th century was consumed by a violent internal dispute called the Arian controversy, a fight over whether Christ was fully divine and equal to God the Father from eternity, or a lesser created being who had been granted divine status. The Son of Man in the Book of Enoch, hidden in God's presence before the stars existed, named before the sun was created, cut directly and uncomfortably into that debate. Rather than do the difficult theological work of resolving it, the councils removed the text that was generating the problem, cleaner to erase the question than to answer it in public. The third problem was the one they never stated out loud, and it was the most honest of the 3. The Book of Enoch, the Ascension of Isaiah, and every other Ethiopian text pointed toward direct personal experience of God as the center of faith. Direct encounters with the divine without a priest, a bishop, a council, or an institution standing in between. The entire financial and political architecture of institutional Christianity rested on a single premise: that clergy were the necessary bridge between God and humanity, and that without crossing that bridge, you could not reach salvation. Remove that premise, and the institution collapses, the wealth collapses, the political influence that came with controlling access to the divine collapses. The men who made these decisions understood exactly what was at stake. They were not careless. They were deliberate. In 363, at the Council of Laodicea, the Book of Enoch was formally cut from the accepted canon. In 367, Bishop Athanasius circulated a letter establishing the 27 books of the standard New Testament. The Book of Enoch was not among them. Neither was the Ascension of Isaiah. They were labeled apocryphal, a word meaning hidden away, which in practice meant removed from every shelf ordinary believers could reach. Copies were burned. Those who defended the texts were condemned. The Ethiopian church was not in any of those rooms. When Islam swept across North Africa in the 7th century and cut Ethiopia off from the Mediterranean world entirely, Ethiopian Christianity found itself isolated by geography, by language, and by history from every political pressure reshaping the Western faith. They had been Christians since the 4th century when their king converted, making Ethiopia one of the oldest Christian nations on earth. They missed the councils, they missed the book burnings, and so they kept copying. Month after month, year after year, century after century, monks sat in stone rooms lit by oil lamps with grinding headaches and ruined eyesight and spines bent permanently from hours of leaning over manuscripts. They shaped every letter of the Ge'ez script by hand because they believed they were protecting the complete Word of God for generations that had not yet been born. Then in 1947, a teenager in the Judean desert threw a rock into a cave and heard pottery shatter. What came out of that cave included 11 Aramaic manuscripts of the Book of Enoch, carbon dated to the 2nd and 3rd centuries before Christ, 300 years before Christ was born. The Western Church had spent 15 centuries calling the text a medieval forgery, an unreliable pseudonymous work, apocryphal folklore not fit for public consumption. A teenager throwing a rock destroyed every single one of those arguments in a single afternoon. You cannot call something a medieval forgery when archaeology just proved it was being copied 300 years before the medieval period had even begun. The Ethiopian monks had been right the entire time. What the scrolls did was strip away every argument that had been used against them since 363 in one afternoon, with one rock thrown by a teenager who had no idea what he was about to find. The version they could not kill. In August 2025, Lionsgate made an announcement. Mel Gibson's sequel to The Passion of the Christ had release dates. Part 1 of The Resurrection of the Christ would open on Good Friday, March 26, 2027. Part 2 would follow exactly 40 days later on Ascension Day, May 6, 2027. The scale of what Gibson is building is unlike anything in the history of religious filmmaking. The combined budget is $200 million. Principal photography began on October 6, 2025 at Cinecittà Studios in Rome, the same facility where the landmark biblical epics of the 20th century were shot. Additional filming is taking place across southern Italy in Gravina, in Puglia, Matera, and Genosa. Lionsgate is distributing. People inside the production have described it publicly as one of the most ambitious religious films ever attempted. Gibson spent 7 years writing the script alongside his brother Donald and Braveheart screenwriter Randall Wallace. When he sat down with Joe Rogan to describe what they had built, he called it an acid trip. He said he had never read anything like it. He said the film covers the span from the fall of the angels to the death of the last apostle, and that the only way to tell it properly was to go to hell. Deadline confirmed the production includes battles between angels and demons in other realms, and that the structure is not a linear retelling of familiar gospel scenes. The original Passion of the Christ earned $612 million on a $30 million budget and held the record as the highest-grossing R-rated film in American box office history for nearly 20 years. If the sequel reaches even a fraction of that audience, hundreds of millions of people are going to sit in dark theaters and meet a version of Jesus Christ that the Western Church spent 15 centuries making sure they never encountered. The question underneath all of this is not comfortable. If a vision of Christ, this thoroughly documented, could be so completely buried that billions of people lived and died without knowing it existed, then what else was removed? The monks who kept the texts alive never knew any of this would happen. They did it because their fathers did it before them, and their fathers before that, and all the way back to men who had made a choice in the 4th century to simply keep copying what they had always used, instead of following instructions from councils they had never attended. They destroyed their eyesight doing it. They bent their spines doing it. They carried manuscripts through darkness and gunfire doing it. They gave their entire lives to protecting something the rest of the world had been told did not exist. In Ethiopian churches today, the Christ those monks preserved looks out from the sacred paintings on the walls. Dark skin, wide penetrating eyes that sit in the face like they are looking straight through whatever they land on. Rays of gold push outward from around him like the light inside cannot be fully held by the body containing it. He is shown as both completely human and utterly cosmic at the same time, tender and terrifying in the same image. In the Ethiopian tradition, he is called Lord of the Universe. Their tradition does not introduce him with comfort first. It introduces him with awe, because before you can approach him as a friend, a savior, or anything familiar, you have to first understand exactly who he is, the being who spoke the universe into existence, the one who was named before the sun was created, the judge before whom every king, every ruler, and every fallen angel will one day stand and have nothing to say. That is the Christ the Western Church buried. That is the Christ the Ethiopian monks preserved. And that is the Christ that is about to walk into every theater on earth in 2027, exactly as old, exactly as dark, and exactly as powerful as the men who tried to erase him were afraid he was.